In the summer of 2017, a scientist tweeted a prediction, not a meteorologist, not someone with access to satellite data, ocean temperature models, or supercomputers, an ornithologist in Delaware studying songbirds. He predicted the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season would be significantly worse than average. At the exact same time, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with all its resources, all its data, all its forecasting power, was predicting a below-average season. 5 months later, the results came in. 2017 became one of the most devastating hurricane seasons in modern American history. Harvey, Irma, Maria. The government's models had been wrong. The birdwatcher had been right. His prediction hadn't come from radar, or satellites, or ocean buoys. It came from watching when a small brown bird decided to stop building nests. Today, we're going inside one of the strangest, most quietly validated discoveries in modern ornithology, and the small forest bird that may be reading the coming hurricane season months before the storms even begin to form. Meet the Veery, a small, tawny brown thrush, easily overlooked, known mostly among birders for its eerie, downward spiraling, flute-like song, echoing through summer forests across the northern United States and southern Canada. Nothing about this bird suggests meteorological genius. It's not large, it's not exotic, it doesn't have any obvious specialized organ for sensing weather. Every summer, Veeries breed across the cooler forests of North America, raising typically just one brood of chicks per year. Then, every fall, they undertake a long migration south, crossing the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea, heading toward wintering grounds deep in Brazil. Here's the detail that matters most. That migration happens directly through the heart of Atlantic hurricane season, September and October, precisely when tropical storms are at their most frequent and most dangerous. Since 1998, ecologist Christopher Heckscher at Delaware State University has been tracking a single population of veeries at a breeding site in Delaware, watching year after year exactly when they nested, how many times they tried, and exactly when they finally gave up and began heading south. He wasn't initially studying hurricanes at all, he was simply documenting breeding behavior. But after nearly 2 decades of data, a strange pattern started to emerge. Veeries are persistent nesters. If a nest fails due to a predator, a storm, or any other disruption, a female veery will typically try again, rebuilding and re-nesting, sometimes multiple times within a single season. But Heckscher noticed something odd in his data. In certain years, the birds gave up early. Females who hadn't successfully raised chicks simply stopped trying far sooner than in other years, and began preparing for migration ahead of schedule. At first, this looked like unpredictable natural variation. But when Heckscher lined up nearly 2 decades of nesting data against the historical record of Atlantic hurricane seasons, the pattern became impossible to ignore. In years when veeries ended their breeding season early and produced smaller broods, the following Atlantic hurricane season was consistently more severe. In years when they nested longer and more successfully, the hurricane season that followed tended to be milder. Heckscher published these findings in the scientific journal Scientific Reports in 2018. The correlation wasn't a loose or vague pattern. Statistically, both the timing of nesting and the size of the bird's clutches showed a stronger relationship with the following hurricane season's intensity than pre-season forecasts issued by leading meteorological models. A small forest bird, with no access to satellite imagery or ocean temperature readings, was tracking something that supercomputers were struggling to predict months in advance. By 2017, Heckscher had enough confidence in the pattern to test it publicly. Midway through that summer, his veery population had already cut their breeding season noticeably short. Based purely on that behavior, he made a public prediction. The upcoming Atlantic hurricane season, he said, would be significantly more intense than what official government forecasters were currently projecting. It was, by his own admission, a nerve-wracking thing to say publicly. He wasn't a meteorologist. He was pitting a small population of songbirds in Delaware against some of the most sophisticated weather modeling systems on the planet. 5 months later, the season ended. 2017 turned out to be one of the most destructive Atlantic hurricane seasons in recorded history. driven by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. The accumulated cyclone energy for that season, a standard measurement of overall hurricane intensity, fell squarely within the range Heckscher had projected based entirely on bird behavior. The official preseason government forecasts had significantly underestimated it. Andrew Farnsworth, a bird migration expert at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who wasn't involved in the research, later called the finding logically sound, adding that a pattern like this, once you actually looked for it, made real biological sense. The obvious question is how? How could a small songbird possibly gather information about a hurricane season that hadn't even begun yet? Heckscher's leading theory doesn't involve any mysterious sixth sense. It centers on where these birds spend their winters and the subtle environmental clues waiting for them there. Veeries winter primarily in Brazil, in a region influenced heavily by two major recurring climate patterns, El Niño and La Niña, shifts in Pacific Ocean temperatures that also happen to strongly influence Atlantic hurricane activity. These same climate patterns affect rainfall in the Veeries' wintering habitat, which in turn affects the availability of fruit, a critical part of their diet in South America. Heckscher believes that subtle shifts in food availability tied to these broader climate patterns may be quietly altering the bird's body condition, hormone levels, and physiological readiness well before they ever return north to breed. In his own words, something happening in their blood chemistry or hormones may be causing them to adjust their breeding timing long before any hurricane has even started to form thousands of miles away. Essentially, the birds may not be predicting the hurricane season directly at all. They may be responding to the same underlying global climate signal that eventually determines how severe that season turns out to be, just detecting it earlier and more directly than our own forecasting models currently can. If this discovery is amazing, you, as much as it amazed the researchers studying it, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people. There's a second layer to this discovery that makes it even more remarkable. Why would ending the breeding season early actually help a Veery survive a bad hurricane season? The timing of a Veery's fall migration is directly tied to when it finishes breeding. Birds that nest later, or attempt more renests after early failures, end up migrating later in the season. Later migration means crossing the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean deeper into peak hurricane season, directly through the most dangerous window of the year. By ending their nesting attempts early in years destined to bring severe storms, Veeries may be giving themselves valuable flexibility. More time to either complete their migration before the worst storms fully develop, or more room to delay and adjust their timing around dangerous weather, rather than being forced to fly directly into it. In other words, this isn't simply a curious coincidence. It may be a genuine survival strategy refined by evolution over countless generations of Veeries that flew directly into deadly storms and didn't survive to pass on their genes. The birds responding earliest and adjusting their migration timing most effectively would have been the ones most likely to make it through. This discovery raises a genuinely important question for modern science. If a small forest bird can pick up on a climate signal months before it fully develops, what exactly is it detecting that our own instruments are still missing? Researchers are careful to note that Veeries aren't replacing meteorological forecasting. Modern hurricane models remain essential, especially for predicting the exact path and timing of individual storms once they've actually formed. But Heckscher's research suggests something valuable about pre-season intensity: the broader question of how active an entire hurricane season is likely to be, months before the first storm ever appears on radar. Some researchers now suggest that studying the physiological cues driving this behavior, whatever is happening in the Veery's blood chemistry that connects distant rainfall patterns to nesting decisions, could eventually offer new insight into the same broader climate systems meteorologists are already working to model, not replacing our technology, potentially revealing a piece of the puzzle it's still missing. An animal that has apparently been reading these signals successfully for as long as it has existed long before humans built our first weather satellite. So the next time you hear a small flute-like song echoing through a summer forest, and it happens to belong to a veery, pay attention to what that bird decides to do next. Somewhere in its behavior and when it nests, how many times it tries, and when it finally gives up and turns south, maybe information about the coming months that our own forecasters are still racing to catch up to. Not magic, not folklore. 20 years of careful field data and one small brown bird, quietly outperforming some of the most advanced weather models humans have ever built. If this story changed the way you'll look at the birds in your backyard, subscribe to Birdhearts so you never miss the next hidden mystery in the bird world. And tell me in the comments, would you trust a bird's behavior over an official weather forecast? I'll see you in the next one.